Здравейте отново, добър вечер. Съжалявам, извиняваме се за закъснението, но искахме всички хора, които искат да видят мастер-класа, да влязат на време. Моето име е Димитър Озунов и заедно с Ралица Асенова сме част от Арт Урбана колектив и организираме тази година European Short Pitch тук в София, като събитието е част от програмата на Пловдив 2019, Европейска столица на културата. И тъй като мастер-класа ще е на английски, ще превключа на английски. So, I'm very happy to see you tonight. My name is Dimitar Ozunov, and together with Ralica Assenova, we are part of Art Urbana Collective, organizers, together with, of course, with NISI MASA of European Short Pitch 2019. And tonight, I would like to invite Wim Vanacker, who is the head of the script department of NISI MASA, to moderate the workshop, to masterclass with Pierre Hodgson. Thank you.
So first of all, welcome everyone. So I'm Wim Vanacker, I'm the head of the script department, and maybe before we get started, I just want to say two words about European Short Pitch. So European Short Pitch is a development workshop for short films, and we have a one-week script writing session, which this year is taking place in Sofia, and then in 2 months, people will pitch their project in front of 40, 50 European producers. So Pierre is one of our tutors. And we have 4, there's a few others in the room. And all of our tutors, they have very diverse kind of background. And I think in that sense, Pierre is a perfect example. And that's also why we decided to talk about the state of independent cinema today. It's obviously, we won't supply you with any definite answers, but it's more about supplying you with some food for thought, you know, with things that might inspire you or re-energize you to think differently about cinema and stuff. So, but to start, I think it might be a good idea just to briefly define like how you see cinema, or you know what cinema stands for you personally.
Well, firstly, I have to say I really don't have any special legitimacy any more than anybody else in this room. We all go and see films. It's all part of our history, and I've worked in film in lots of different areas, but always in a very ad hoc capacity. I don't feel I have any particular career status to say. So I'm really a privileged observer for having worked with people. And what I think is that this is the most interesting time really in my life, because we are compelled now to ask this question that you've just asked me, which really, when I started out, I mean, I think the first time I worked on a film was in 1983, so it's a long time ago. Nobody was asking that kind of question. It wasn't necessary. But now we have series, we have you know, the web fiction, we have all the stuff that we all know, and then within film there's, you know, there's blockbusters, and then there's what we do, which is European independent film, and we really have to think about where we sit in relation to that. And my answer is a very basic one, which is going to seem so stupid to most people in this room, but what we do is theatrical. What we do is collective. What we do is independent, it's personal, and it is designed to be seen on a scale which is larger than the human body, and which involves a lot of work on sound to make the world outside the frame come to life. And when you start applying those things and saying, oh, but do people still want that stuff? Then you start thinking about the audiences, and then this very kind of simple definition actually becomes interesting. And I would say, Wim, to you that every minute of what we do in a week like this, where we're working on screenplays, we cannot afford not to ask that question. And because I'm an ill-mannered person, I often say to people I'm working with as a consultant, go and work in TV if that's what you want to do, you know, because people forget that at this crucial time, we actually have to reinvent and defend something, which is the secret and the personal on a theatrical scale.
And like for you personally, now knowing more about how you look at cinema or the responsibility of cinema, what would you define as the main role cinema should embody or stand for?
You know, I have a cute answer to that, which is to say, you know, if you go to see huge corporations, they have something called an R&D department, research and development department. And that's what I think that we're for. And in fact, if you look at the way things work in America, you take a director like, say, Doug Liman, who's a very well-known Hollywood director who has giant budgets. He started off making his first film, which he paid for himself, which cost $200,000. And then he sold that to Harvey Weinstein, who at that time was an acceptable person to speak to, for $5 million. And that's how he built his career. So that's the American system. So, but he invented a way of doing something that related to his generation and a way of making something. And by making that, it also involves writing, and it also involves casting and all sorts of things. It's not just the technical, what we think of as the technical side. And so, and this applies in Europe too. And Europeans are actually very bad at it for reasons we may want to discuss later. But to think of this is a place where we have to break new ground. We have to innovate. We have to surprise people. We have to take account and think about what the electronic industries are doing to the human brain and how human need and use for sound and image is changing. And we cannot do our work as artists, as craftsmen, as thinkers, without taking this into account. And this is not what happens in what you could call the studio system, which is a weird term to use in Europe, but there is such a kind of thing. So we need to think about our time more than we need to think about ourselves, in fact.
And if you like the flaws of, let's say, the system you're pointing out now, obviously it's a very multi-layered thing, but for you personally, what do you think is mainly responsible for this? Obviously, there's the funding systems that come into play, the choices producers make. There's a responsibility of the filmmakers.
Well, you know, one of the reasons why I think it's a very exciting time is because in the history of cinema, as in the history of every other art form, in fact, you live through a cycle, and the cycle is one of things getting progressively more academic. And then some people, we can call them young Turks, reinvent the system, and you get new Hollywood in the 70s and what, you know, Francis Coppola and George Lucas did, or you get the Nouvelle Vague in Paris. But in fact, it's always happened, neorealism in Italy. And so we are at such a time, and it's very important for young filmmakers to think about that. Now, what are they fighting? What they're fighting is a European funding system which is a disaster in my view. It's a very provocative thing to say. Everybody in my business says, oh no, you shouldn't say such things, don't rock the boat, we all live off it. The truth is, it does not produce surprises, it does not produce energy, it does not produce much artistic innovation, and one of the reasons is it has made producers who, even when I was beginning in the 80s, were pirates, were gamblers, were people who would literally go to the casino to try and get money for the next day's shoots. Today's producers are people who have been not just to university, but to a film school to university, and then through a lab system, and probably been trained 10 years to fill out forms and apply to Europe for money exactly the same way as if they were a ministry, in fact. And it shows. So the audiences are reducing because European filmmakers, of whom there are many in this room, are somehow being trained to make films for themselves, to make films for who chooses what films get funded, who chooses what films go to festivals, who chooses how it works. Answer, professionals, semi-professionals, and you end up talking to yourself. And the Bible tells us incest is illegal, and there's a reason for it, which is incest produces deformation. It ceases to function. It becomes, in fact, sterile. And this is the stage we're at. So that the good news is, yippee, it's time to use our imaginations. It's time to surprise audiences, because if we don't, we're going to be dead. And we've discussed this with one before, but it feels a little obvious to say, but there are millions of migrants entering this continent. We have a political system which is closing down hospitals and privatizing them. And do you think people are going to go on publicly funding a system that produces hundreds of films in Europe a year that nobody wants to see? The answer is no. The system is condemned unless we use our brains, our energy, our imagination to reinvent it. And that's what's so exciting about things like, ESP.
Like for you, like this whole notion of preaching to the choir, if you would, let's say, supply us with a solution to the problem, where do you think it starts from? It starts with the filmmakers themselves, or?
Yeah, I think, filmmakers need to regain their independence. You have to stop changing your projects to suit a funding body. Every workshop I take part in, I hear the same stories. People are regarding themselves as, but this is what we call in British English a losing wicket. You can't win that way. You have to win by making the funding body come to you, making the producers come to you. And that is, stopping thinking of yourselves, if you're, researchers, scientific researchers in universities, they apply for grants, they call it grant writing. We can't do that in our business. We're meant to be artists. So what we do is we use our very personal, intimate, dangerous stuff, and we put it before the public. And the skill with which we do that is what makes people want to give us money to go on working. And that is the only way it can work. So yes, it's down to filmmakers and all of us who work with filmmakers to regain the confidence that if we're chasing after bureaucratic producers and funding organizations, they are going to destroy us. And it's up to us to regain that energy.
I think to lots of people it would also very much sound like a catch-22, because obviously when you want to make films, there's money needed. But do you think, for instance, when it comes to, let's say, funding systems, the American system is a healthier approach to filmmaking, or?
I've never worked in America, and I couldn't talk about that. But what I can say is, find a producer who is a good producer, and a good producer is a producer who, once he or she has committed to a project, is fighting for that project against refusals from the funding organizations. It's very simple. If your producer is a producer who sends the thing to his national funding organization or her national funding organization, a couple of co-productions, Arte or Image, say goodbye to that producer. That's a bad producer. Producers invent the right funding for that project. And in France, where I've lived for 25 years now, the obvious thing is it's time to go to private funding. It's so obvious. Renewal will not come from within the French system. It's not possible. This is my very provocative view. And, you know, there are very, very, very few French producers who can get their head around that. But when I say that, I'm not saying we should do what the Americans do. I'm saying that project by project, what is going to give the project freedom to surprise audiences and give audiences something that they're not expecting, that's all they want. And it's what the current system is not doing.
But then let's say, you know, we'd go for a more provocative, audacious kind of cinema as, you know, European independent filmmakers. But obviously the whole notion of audience comes into play as well. And do you think there's actually an audience out there who's waiting for those kind of films?
That's a very central and lovely question, and the answer is a complex one, because when you're writing, you have to write, in my view, to your audience. If you look at the great theoreticians of film writing, like Frank Daniel, who's the saint, you know, they will say, okay, audience expectation is what you're playing with. And yes, you want to express your ideas. Yes, you want to give your point of view. Yes, you want to say something about how you see the world. But you're actually dueling, fencing with the audience at the writing stage. So if you do that, you start thinking about, you know, what that audience might be. And this is where, I mean, I really, really strongly believe, and I fought with many of my French friends over the years, in producers. Because the conversation with the producer about what the audience for this film is, about how to design the funding so that it's appropriate to the audience, so it's appropriate to the writing, the chemistry of that situation. And perhaps if we talk about the American system or whatever, which is a silly thing to do because we don't know enough about it, talk about it in public. But what I know of it is that there is an alchemy there where it's a natural conversation between the writers, director maybe, and the producer about how you're going to structure funding so that it relates to the audience, and don't exclude producers from the artistic conversation, which is one of the bad things about them being bureaucrats who say, you know, I need a 300-word synopsis to send to the Dutch by next Tuesday. You know, you just want to kill yourself. Everybody's going to die of boredom, and the audience is most of all. So I think the audience is there, but it's down to us to say what audience I'm going for. If I want to make a highly personal, extremely experimental film, which is my personal preference, then of course there's no point in trying to persuade a huge multinational company to fund it. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because now it also feels like there's a lack of options when as a filmmaker. You know, you can look to your national film fund, and that's more or less it, you know, in most cases. So, but
Wim, just let me interrupt you for a second. This is the crucial thing. If I can get this into all the filmmakers' minds here, make them come to you. Make them come to you. They need you. It happens time again. There's lots of stories. If a film attracts an audience, or even gets into a festival, and the national funder has not funded it, or even, you know, the TV channel, whatever, the Artes, the Canal Places of this world, have not funded it, they look bad and they don't like it. Make them come to you. Make them be interested in you. Don't chase after them. It's like teaching a teenager how to date, you know.
One of the things which I think is interesting to talk about as well is, you know, we can talk about filmmaking and the fact that filmmakers need to become responsible again and need to reinvent, let's say, the language of cinema and stuff like this, and reinvent whatever we try to stand for as filmmakers. But how do you think this would affect the narrative form or how, because it's also a very vague statement, because most people want to make films, and then obviously it's always going to be the same thing, that lots of people will make films that still fit the bill, that are still part of the 13 in a dozen kind of spectrum. And I'm just interested in hearing your take on this as well, like the whole notion of the narrative form, how to go about this. And
well, firstly, I think, as I said, that the main reason why people want to just make another standard Euro art house film for festivals is a lack of confidence, and that you can, and it's our job in our position as consultants, script doctors, the things we do, to give people the confidence to do that. That's the first thing. Narrative is central to cinema. I said, you asked me what's cinema about. I said its inheritance is theatre. That doesn't mean to say that I like, theatrical films with very good actors and a lot of costumes. It just means that is our relationship to the audience, and that puts writing in a very specific place. And the relationship of writing to the film, in my view, is often misunderstood. And that when you write something, it is a seed you're designing, and nobody expects the seed to look like the tree. The writing is not, in my view, and should not be considered as this is a polemical thing to say, but as a representation of what you're going to see on screen. It should instill in the reader of the script emotions, a sense of character, and a sense of meaning that the film is going to provide. And that, in order to do that, you have to master the technical craft of writing. It's part of cinema, in the same way that the technicalities of cinematography or of sound are part of cinema. And once you know those rules, break them. The way has always happened, great cinematographers and people have done in sound. Of course, playing with the rules is part of being this R&D experimental thing. But unless you understand, and this is very hard now, and we see it in these workshops like we're doing this week in Sofia, because people actually film before they write these days. This is historically quite new. Filming was very expensive when I was 20. And people film before they write, and they have, editing software in their computers. So they actually learn the language of image and sound before they learn the craft of writing. And this is both extremely interesting, because I hope it will change writing, but it doesn't mean they should not also be learning the craft of writing. And it is central to what you were talking about, which is the relationship with an audience. Writing is about communicating with your audience, as I said. So if you believe, as I believe, that cinema is about a relationship with an audience, then writing has to be the starting point.
And obviously, for me, the first thing that comes to mind when you mention the process is also the whole notion of writer-directors. And do you have a specific opinion about this? Is it something that you think is counterproductive, or it's just a matter of making sure you prioritize things at the right time, the right moment in time?
So, I have to put my cards on the table. I've probably written 20 screenplays that have been shot, or maybe 15 that have been shot, and probably 40 that haven't, or something, like most people. And I've only ever worked as a co-writer with writer-directors. I just wouldn't do anything else. But one of the reasons, because I'm interested in a form of intimacy that it can only really come, I think, from that conjunction and I also belong to a culture where it's a standard thing. But a writer-director is a writer first and then a director. And a lot of what we do in workshops like this is say, stop being a director for a week, be a writer. And it's a very different part of the brain. You are inventing worlds. One of the things that I think we need to say, because time is short, is as well as changing the funding and the relationship with funding bodies, there's also something to do, if you want to surprise audiences, with where you set your stories with the subject matter. And it is, actually I've been working across the river in Romania a lot, and this goes down very badly when I say that, but it's time to open the imagination and to go into imaginary worlds. This is something that cinema can do comfortably, and this is part of the writing process. If you are only trying to describe your everyday life, you're not going to get audiences doing that today. This is not, in my view, you can disagree, the time to be doing that. So, writer-directors are particularly writers when they're dealing with imaginary worlds, when you can't just point your iPhone at the thing and start filming it and think you're a filmmaker doing that.
Yeah, I think that definitely sounds like one solution to fight the boredom we were talking about beforehand. But I think we're also as good as running out of time. So what I would like to do now is just to open up the room for questions. Sofia, if there's anything you would like to ask to Pierre or to myself, feel free to do so.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Maria. I was interested in what you said about filmmakers or producers going to private fundings, or like the future or the idea behind it. I was wondering what is your attitude towards how will they get their money back? Like, for example, in America, the studios get their money back easily through the box office because it's such a huge market. And even if it's a huge market, still for independent cinema or for more art house films, it's more difficult to attract enough audience to get, for example, a $4 million budget film to regain the money back and make some earnings. And with Europe being a smaller market and more closed one, what do you think, how will they get there? Like, how will they attract audience, or how would that work? Because I'm sure, like, if we go to some dentist and ask him to give us 200,000 euros for our film, I'm sure he will say, like, will I get them back, and how much will I earn?
Okay. Firstly, I'm not a producer, so I'm speaking as a writer and as somebody who's been in the scene, what I think. And like most of the things I say, it's probably stupid, but it's what so that's, it's one man's point of view. Secondly, I come from London, and there's a long tradition in London which is called Theatrical Angels, which is the London theatre scene, which, as you know, is probably the most vibrant and powerful and complex in the world, is essentially privately funded. And it's privately funded because there is a culture and a tradition of people putting money into plays, and about 1 in 50 get their money back. And there's no tax shelter, by the way. Some people are very, spoiled, because tax shelter is more bureaucracy. So that's just one thing I'd say. Second, another thing I'd say is, why is private money interesting? Because it changes the conversation, that the filmmaker and the producer have. It actually puts the audience there. So again, you're not necessarily saying, make a commercial film because you have private money. People will pay whatever it is, 10,000 euros for an installation that is set up in a gallery, which, may get sold to a museum or may never make its money back. Actually, Europe is a very big market. It's a complicated market because it's a very fragmented one by culture and by language. But you know, a lot of film producers manage to produce films by selling to TV companies. And a lot of those TV companies are private companies, in fact. I was just working in Kiev. The private money in Kiev is huge. And they really make films there and care about it. I don't speak Ukrainian, so I can't go much further in that direction. But so I know, I come from London. There's a lot of private money in film in London. So I think there's also, we need to be aware, I would just say this, that for people in the producing side, it's a drug. You know, sending your thing to Creative Europe and going to your Image and so on. It's a habit. We're in that habit. But if you analyze what it's doing to cinema, is it making, you know, cinema that people want to see? I would say, because I happen to be, in my stupid way, more interested in this, is it creating artistic energy? Is it creating surprising, great, you know, creative films? Answer, definitely not. The films that European public funding are backing are on the whole uninteresting. Let's say it. Let's say it publicly. There are many, many exceptions, and we're very glad of those exceptions. But to say we mustn't look for money elsewhere, it would be suicide. So the real question, if I was a producer, would be to say, okay, we have to look for money elsewhere. How can it work? How can the maths add up? What's the thing? And I'm sure that the answer is going to be going back to the weird producers I worked with before, which is you lose money on a lot of films, and then you make a film which pays for the lot of them. I mean, it's always been like that. Why shouldn't it be like that again? And I don't see anything in Europe that should prevent that from happening in Europe, despite the clear complications. You know, we're not America. We don't have one language coast to coast.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My name is Stoyan. I'm a scientist, actually. I live in France just like you, and I have to say that we're struggling very much with the same issues with the bureaucracy and the funding. It's very similar, and the need for freedom. But my question is on something else you mentioned about the importance of writing in the seminars, the workshops that you're organizing in different countries. And is this really something that you can teach? Because you mentioned writing, there are two components. There's the imagination, and then there's the skill. And, you know, can you really teach this? And is this something that you just need to have if you're an independent filmmaker? Because if you don't have imagination, then you're probably in the wrong business.
Well, of course you could teach. I mean, you wouldn't ask a music composer. I mean, not everybody's going to be Beethoven, but you can teach rules of composition, and you have to know the rules. And we were saying today, you know, rules are tools. They're just what you need to know in order to start making your imagination effective. And you can teach confidence, which is very, very necessary. You can teach the culture. You can make people aware of different ways of doing things. There's lots of stuff you can do. You cannot guarantee that you're going to produce a new Ingmar Bergman or a new Charlie Chaplin. But
any more questions?
Good evening, my name is Grigor. My question is pretty simple. You said that you really enjoy extremely experimental movies. And my question is simply, what does experimental mean? When does a movie become experimental?
There's a million answers to that. But one answer could be related to what I was saying earlier on about audience experience, which is, in my view, a filmmaker, because to me, it's got this theatrical component in our history, is playing with the audience. So if the audience's experience is to do with form, if the audience's experience is to do not just with character and story, but also with an awareness of, I don't know, image texture, for example, or using silence, or using music, or using something. If you start to take your audience into abstractions, if you start to take your audience into formal games, and that's what conversation, which there's a silent conversation between every member of the audience and the filmmaker. And if that silent conversation goes in that direction, then that might be one, working definition of what experimental cinema is.
So anyone else who has a question?
Pierre, can I ask you also a question? What do you think about like the new technologies and entering into cinema? What do you think it's going to change the cinema in a dramatic way? For example, 3D, or it's still going to be the cinema that we know?
Oh, well, that's a really interesting question. So the first thing is, we've lived through an electronic revolution. It's profoundly changed human beings. It's changed their attention span, it's changed their experience of time, it's changed their memories, it's changed their synaptic connections. And there's no way that independent filmmakers working today cannot think about that and take it into account. So that's one thing, which I very, very strongly believe in, particularly because cinema is about time and what we do with time, and making people leave their bodies for 90 minutes or 2 hours, or in the case of a short film for a lot less, and entering into a different time dimension. So these changes are really important, and we need to think about them. In terms of the sort of special effects end of things, or the format end, cinema is, I said it's to do with theatre, I should have said it's to do with show business. It's a cynical form of prostitution in a way, where we keep trying to get the customers in. And since the history of cinema, they've had to come up with new things to try and make it work, because that's where your profit margins come from. So it was sound, and then it was color, and then they tried 3D with those spectacles and the Black Lagoon, and that didn't really work. And then they tried, all the things, the Sensorama and the Odorama, and now they've tried 3D again, and maybe it will work better this time, or maybe it will be like the last time 3D is, and I'm not competent to say. There are many people who are working on different forms of immersion to make that experience a different one. So far, in my view, because if you looked at it from a writing point of view and a theatrical point of view, that has not fed into writing very successfully. Of course, there are exceptions, which we all know, whatever, James Cameron or whatever, people have the ones they like. But on the whole, it doesn't seem yet to have, and because it starts with writing, and because where writing is the grain, the seed, the genetic bit, until it changes there, I don't really see it happening. But of course, the other thing we have to say, just to finish it, is where we said before, everybody makes films all the time now, because we all have electronic gadgets in our pockets, which mean we can. So the whole relationship, audience relationship to it, is different, which is why these big screens still mean something.
I think on that note, we can wrap things up. Thanks so much, Pierre, for your contribution. It was very insightful and very inspiring. Also, if you're still around and if you're after more inspiration and insight, there's going to be another lecture by some of our other tutors on Friday and Saturday, and it's going to be in the Goethe Institute, and it's going to be the same principle. It's also going to be followed by a screening of European short pitch films. So now you'll see a screening of about 1 hour. It's 4 films, if I'm not mistaken. It's some of the best films that have been developed through European Short Pitch and then have been produced. So, but before we start the screening, I also want to thank Arte Urbana for making European Short Pitch happen here in Sofia. And I also want to thank our funders, Creative Europe, Région Bretagne, and obviously Plovdiv 2019, European Capital of Culture. So good luck, enjoy the films, and if you would have any more questions, we'll be around till the end of this week. So thanks.
And thank you, Wim, of course. So now we'll continue with the screening of 4 short movies. And the masterclass of Britta Krause and Nadia Dumushev is going to be on Friday at 6 p.m. in the Goethe Institute. And in Goethe Institute on Saturday at 2 p.m. there will be the open pitching session. So you can come and see these 16 projects that have been developing here this week. You can experience the pitching of these projects. At 6:30 p.m. on Saturday there will be the masterclass of Leonardo Staliano. Thank you.